talking on a social licence for equestrian sport. Please make him welcome, Rolly Overs.
Good morning all. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the organisers, Tim and Terry, for inviting me all the way across to Australia. It's only the second time I've been to Australia in my life. The first time was almost 35 years ago. I arrived at Sydney on Anzac Day. I had a friend and a family, and he arrived in a pickup truck. We went to Sydney Harbour Bridge, and out of the back of the pickup truck came tables and chairs, and we sat at the foot of Sydney Harbour Bridge having dinner on the evening of Anzac Day. It was a memory that I'll never forget, and I can't believe I've come to another iconic landmark, and because Warringah Park will certainly be a map, a part of the map of the global equestrian map. And Terry said it won't be Olympics here. I think there possibly will be. It's wonderful to be here. When I was in Australia in my year off, I'd run out of money because I'd been travelling for 3 months. I went to work for Bart Cummins and rode out for him for 4 weeks to get some money. So my history with Australia is very narrow and short, but at least I have an understanding a little bit of the equestrian side of it too. And at the beginning of day 2, I was fascinated by yesterday's presentations. The fact that I think the only time I've been 200 kilometres an hour is in a plane. The idea of doing it on one leg down a ski slope is just absolutely mind-blowing. But there you go. I want to say, Terry said yesterday, could you hear me? Could you hear him? And of course, with the facilities we have here, I'm sure no one would need to ever ask that question. But I am very mindful of someone, a friend of mine, who came to Australia about 2 or 3 years ago, and he forgot to ask that question at the beginning of the presentation. And halfway through, he said, "Can everyone hear me?" And the chap at the front said, "Yes, I can hear you, but I'm very happy to swap with someone who can't." So, as Tim said, I'm going to plan to talk for about 45 minutes, and then if we've got time, we'll have some questions at the end of it. And just in terms of outline, I just wanted to introduce you to the organisation that I work for, World Horse Welfare, and our association with equestrian sport. Then just touch on a somewhat corny saying, but we do live in a changing world, and what does that mean? To reflect on what we mean by good equine welfare, and then to relate that into a concept that's been in Australia, certainly for a number of years now, more aligned actually, to be honest, with greyhound racing and more recently with jump racing, and then how we can put that into practice in equestrian sport on a day-to-day basis. I want to reflect very briefly at the end about how we might want to communicate the story of using horses in sport and how we prioritise equine welfare, and then just tie that all together at the end. So, World Horse Welfare is a charity that was founded nearly 100 years ago, in 1927. And at the heart of World Horse Welfare is a practical and pragmatic but caring approach to equine welfare. Our founder witnessed British workhorses being exported to Belgium and to France in the most horrific conditions at the end of their working life, to be met at the end of their time in an abattoir. But from the start, her issue wasn't people eating horse meat, it was the conditions in which those animals were transported. And therefore she actually lobbied to have an abattoir set up in England, the first one ever. And that practical and pragmatic approach runs to the heart of World Horse Welfare today. As our name indicates, we are worldwide. We are working outside Europe in 16 countries, mainly low and middle income countries. And we have a strong veterinary voice, certainly not part of me being a vet, but in our veterinary advisory committee, we have John McEwen, who is a former vice president of the FEI, and we have Professor Tim Parkin at Glasgow University, who's been very involved in the establishment of the Endurance Injuries Surveillance Database, which will be expanded into the discipline of eventing shortly. So what does that mean in practice? As I've indicated, transport and slaughter are a foundation issue for the charity, but our goals have expanded now to include around responsible ownership, as we're going to talk about today, horse sport, but also working equids. And it's always an opportunity I take. You'll notice on the bottom, we have 6 images of equines, 4 horses, excluding the foal, and 2 donkeys. That's very scientifically based because there are 150 million equines in the world today. About 50 million of them are donkeys. So 1 in every 3 equines in the world today are donkeys. But 112 million of those 150 million are working equines. They are working in low and middle income countries across the world, and they support the livelihoods of approximately 750 million people. So I think when we live in a world, as we'll talk about, where there's less and less connection between society and horses, it's extraordinary how horsepower, donkey power, and equine power is still very much a fundamental part of the society and the world we live in 2020. Now, in terms of our activities, you'll see down the side, we've sort of defined into 4 broad areas about what we do. And we don't do all of these across the piece. So when we're talking about intervention in the UK, we run the largest rescue and rehoming service for equines. We take in about 400 every year. We rehome about 300. And currently, across the UK, we have nearly 2,000 horses that have suffered abuse and neglect, that are having a second chance in life in loving new homes. And in low and middle income countries, as I mentioned, 16 of them, we care through a number of community-based projects. But of course, as you look down the scale of activities there, we can only get to 1s to 10s to 100s through contact directly with equines. Where we can make a fundamental difference is where we can influence. Because if we can change policy and if we can change legislation and enforcement of legislation, then we have an ability to impact on the millions of equines that are still in the world today. But of course, today is very much focused more around horse sport. And World Horse Welfare has had a long history in supporting responsible horse sport. And of course, today we will talk a lot around what do we mean by responsible horse sport. For the last 30-odd years, we've been welfare advisors to the International Equestrian Federation, the FEI. And more recently, over the last 15, we've established a similar role in the UK with the British Horse Racing Authority. But that is expanding, and last week we were out at the Asian Racing Conference in Cape Town, talking very much around the issue of social licence today. And of course, in the UK, we are associate members of the British Equestrian Federation. So I hope that shows that we have relatively good credentials when it comes to horse sport and an understanding of the issue that horse sport faces. As I said, it's possibly somewhat trite to say we live in a changing world. Never has that been more the case than now. But of course, change is all about us. And why is that? I think the main reasons are because, A, social media has certainly transformed the way the world communicates and the speed of that communication. We live in a world where there is increasing urbanization of the population. So there's more and more of a dislocation between society and animals, full stop, farm animals and large animals, including equines. And we certainly live in a world where activism and animal rights is growing. And it's in some parts of the world it's growing very strongly. And it is a huge challenge because in some parts of the world, it's very well funded. And therefore, it's not something we can simply ignore. Because there are people who, you and I, are both of that view that we have a partnership with our horses. But there are those in animal activists who believe increasingly that's exploitation, especially of animals in horse sport. And there is a growing view, but rather than it's all about use, not abuse, there's a growing view that all use of equines is abuse. Horse sport is certainly a global issue, a global sport now. And what happens in one part of the world very quickly influences and gets a reputation in the other part of the world. I'll never forget, it was not long after I joined the charity. I was in South Africa visiting one of our projects in Soweto, And it was half an hour after the end of the Grand National. Many of you will have heard of the Grand National steeplechase in the UK, quite a controversial race. And 2 horses had died in that race. And I was asked at a press interview in Soweto, 20 minutes after that race had finished, what I thought about the Grand National that day. And that shows just a very small example of what a small world we do indeed live in. And I think we've got to recognise that from an ethical point of view, horse sport is on quite a tightrope. It's on quite a tightrope, partly because of our own making. I think the quote here from the investigation into following on from the 7:30 ABC programme here in Australia last year is quite telling. The racing industry in Australia has fundamentally failed to intervene at industry level to effectively protect retired racehorses. Those are damning words indeed. And of course, we can all argue about what is public perception and what is reality. But the reality is that the more headlines we have like that, is the more damage it'll do to our sport. And of course, I certainly wouldn't want to say this is an issue that Australia is facing on its own. Nothing could be further from the truth. Whether you are talking from the US, the UK, South Korea, Ireland, or indeed in any racing jurisdiction around the world, you have bad news stories almost on a weekly basis. It is something that the media seems to want to focus on, and that is the here and now. But of course, it's not just racing, it's very much horse sport across the piece. And so generally, when I'm talking today about horse sport, I'm very much including racing in that. Now, we know about, over the last 10 or 15 years, the focus there has been around Rollkur. And there was a huge movement within the FEI about 10 years ago to redefine it. And a lot of work was done to improve the standard of stewarding. But that was in 2010. Look in 2020, when you've got the likes of Hector Carmona, who's a Chilean. I think he lives in Sweden. But look at this recent thing he put out on Facebook. The FEI and the Spanish Riding School, blatant horse abuse. And he has a number of followers, thousands of followers. And I know Grania, who is the head of communications, or director of communications at the FEI, she and her team, they spend a lot of time, and I'm sure Bettina too, in answering a lot of communications that follow on from this kind of social media coverage. So I hope that shows that we really are living in a changing world, and we are living in a world which is facing growing challenges to horse sport across the piece. And of course, 2019, Rotterdam, the European Jumping Championships. I think Mark Hautziger, doing his round, extraordinarily, he did a clear round when 2 protesters got into the arena to demonstrate against horse abuse within horse sport. That is the world we live in. That is the European Championships last year. And there will be far more headlines like that, I am sure. So as we've talked about, unfortunately, like it or lump it, bad news does travel fast. And like it or lump it, what happens in racing, what happens in endurance, what happens in dressage, as far as the great public is concerned, that is people using horses for sport and entertainment. We all get labelled under the same view. And therefore, we really do have to take this seriously. And one of the mantras, real things I have, we can never just say to people, we look after our horses well. Because that and in the vast majority of cases, is absolutely true. But if you are the great public, you will think, well, that's the minimum they should be doing. What else are you doing if you are putting horses at risk through horse sport? So I hope that shows the challenges that we're facing. How is the horse sport world responding? Well, of course, through the FEI, and it was written in conjunction with World Horse Welfare, we have the FEI Code of Conduct for the welfare of the horse, which is very, very clear. And it's a list of criteria for ensuring we protect and enhance equine welfare within horse sport. But what federations need to do is very much more implement that code of conduct within their strategy. Only recently, the British Equestrian Federation, we had to work quite hard to make sure that the code of conduct was implemented across the piece in the strategy for the BEF. But of course, far more likely is the reaction that the horse world is taking, the equine world. We've already talked about the investigation into the ABC programme, but very much following in a similar vein, following a petition to the British government, the British Racing has set up an independent horse welfare board. And they last week published their strategy about a good life for British racehorses. We've got a very similar thing happening here in Australia, and indeed you'll see similar things happening across the world as the racing world, as the horse sport world reacts to this changing environment. But is it enough? So let's turn our minds to what we mean by good equine welfare. From the outset, we need to understand that it's not just the physical well-being of our horses, but it's also their mental well-being. And I think when we consider over the years that our understanding of what we mean by equine welfare has changed and is changing, then we need to be far more open that we will change the way we care for our horses as a result. We have to, as I'll come on to later, be able to adapt to change and challenge ourselves as are we really looking after our horses in the best way we can. Because just because we've always done things one way doesn't necessarily make it right. If we take a step back, some of you will be very familiar with the One Health concept, which is, or the One Health concept talks about the health of humans, is interlinked with the health of animals, which is interlinked with the health of our environment. And when we consider issues like antimicrobial resistance, which many believe is one of the biggest challenges and risks facing the world today, that becomes very, very relevant. But we can also view it in terms of one welfare, because the welfare of our animals is interrelated with the welfare of people, indeed, and the health and biodiversity of our environment. So, what do we mean by good equine welfare? As I said, it is evolving, and Professor David Mellor puts it so well here. The overall objective now is not just about giving our horses a life worth living, it is giving them a good life. So they thrive and not just survive. But we have to understand that equine welfare is multidimensional. It is not just about their physical welfare. It applies to all stages of their life. And so our understanding, for example, of geriatric horses, which used to be any horse over 15, but now, as the horses live longer, it's now over 20. But horses, like people, are living longer and longer. The welfare of those animals needs to be adapted as they do so. And whilst I'm always very wary of being anthropomorphic, we cannot impose human ideals and values on equines, we do have to understand that somewhat like humans, they are individuals. And what works for one equine, one horse, doesn't necessarily work for another. There's been a growing debate. Obviously, I come from a country where for the last 3 years, we've been talking nothing about except about Brexit, which is a delightful subject, and if anyone wants to ask me about it afterwards, I'll be leaving. But it is a really relevant thing because it was a political football during that debate. But animals are sentient beings. They can feel both physically and they can feel emotionally. And we have to make sure that in assessing their quality of life, we place that at the heart of it. And as I'll talk about in a second, it's not just about making sure we avoid our animals and our equines avoiding any negative experiences. So when we look at the history of animal welfare, without doubt, one of the key developments over the last 50 years has been development of the 5 freedoms. Developed in the UK by the then Farm Animal Welfare Council, I would say, and it's been shown to be proved, it has transformed the welfare of millions of farm animals across the world. But there are challenges, and we've moved on from the 5 freedoms for 2 reasons. One, firstly, you'll see that almost all of these is the avoidance of the negative. So we need to think about, actually, that's one part of it, but it's giving them the positives too. But also, we need to realize that actually pain, might sound an odd thing to say, is a very important protective mechanism. So if we don't have pain as humans, as animals, then we'll not be able to protect that limb or wherever that is from actually getting better in the end. So actually pain, we don't eat generally unless we feel hungry, and that's even more true for animals. So our understanding of welfare has changed to now we talk about the 5 domains. And what you'll see here is how the nutritional, environmental, behavioral, and health requirements of animals, of equines, all feeds in to their mental state. So yes, we do need to avoid the negative, but we also need to enhance the positive. And we need to be thinking about their mental welfare as much, and their mental well-being as much, if not more, than their physical well-being. Looking at that a different way, you'll often hear now people talk about the 3 Fs of forage, freedom, and friends. Because we do need to remember where equines have come from. They have come from a herd basis where they graze for 17 hours a day, and that friendship between the groups, being a flight animal, that friendship between the groups is really important. And so we need to consider, as we keep our horses in sometimes quite different circumstances to how the prairies are, that whether we are giving them enough freedom, whether we are giving them enough time to have their friendships, and certainly whether they have access to good quality forage almost 24/7. So, having heard of all of that developments around equine welfare, we've got to ask ourselves, have we got the balance right between what many people understand as important is their physical welfare, but are we considering their mental well-being as much? And I think a key issue here is investment in research. I've talked about how our understanding of animal welfare is developing as time goes on. A lot of that is because of the investment in research that's gone on around the world. And whenever we make decisions about our equines, and this doesn't matter whether you're an individual equine owner or you're a regulator at the other end, we need to make decisions based on 3 things. Firstly, as far as possible, we base it on the evidence. Secondly, we base it on our experience, and of course, we have a considerable experience over the years in how we care for our horses, but also we must never forget common sense. And I think if we can get that triumvirate right, then we will be making the right decisions for our horses. But having said all that, what do the public think? And is that a rather odd question to be asking when we in the horse world have been looking after our animals for many, many years and know how to do it? Well, in fact, as I've said earlier about a changing world, we do have to consider what the public think. And we can no longer, as a sector, and there are some still in the sector who do this, who will say, I know about how to look after the horses, the public do not, I will carry on doing what I'm doing. Now, if you want to play that game, then you've only got to look at greyhound racing in Australia, which almost, well, in fact, in one state, it did get banned, didn't it, for a while, and then got rescinded. But it went to the wall because there was growing outcries about what happens to greyhounds when they left the greyhound track, and the industry ignored it. Not saying everyone ignored it, but certainly those in positions of authority did. And as a result, it came perilously close to being banned. And why? Because they lost their social license to operate. What do we mean by that? Social license is something that's not new. Actually, it's over 200 years old. And it's most recently came into being in the late 90s in the mining industry. Because if you think about the mining industry, they send people underground and put people who are in mines at great risk. And mines can potentially, and do in part, have a significant environmental impact. And so the more enlightened mining companies have recognized that to be able to carry on doing what they do, mining, that they have to generate a social license to operate. They have to invest in their staff, and they have to invest in the local community so that the local community can accept what they are doing. And I think that is really important. Social license is not a written contract. It's an unwritten understanding between society and, in our case, horse sport. And it is about two things. It is about doing the right thing by our horses, and we'll talk about that in a bit, but it's also telling people that we are doing the right things. Because if we are doing the right thing, in an abstract example, if we are doing the right thing, but the public think we're doing the wrong thing, then we've got an equally big problem. And I think it's a really important point to make here, is that this is not about mob rule. This is not about the public saying, do this, and the sector having to do that because the public's told them. But, as I say, we can no longer ignore the strength of feeling of the public around the use of horses in sport. One of the best examples of this, and we'll talk about it in a second, is the whip. There are many in racing, and when we talk about the use of the whip in racing, who believe that if the whip is removed from racing, that is the thin edge of the wedge. We're on a slippery slope, and slowly, 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 racing will be banned. Equally, you could look at it in a way that that's a cliff edge moment. Unless racing does remove the whip for encouragement, then it might just fall over the cliff and there will be no more racing because of public perception around the use of the whip. So obviously, when we think about social license, there is, not surprisingly, different levels. And we can talk about how greyhound racing in Australia had it withdrawn, at least for a while, because there was a rejection by the public of greyhound racing, about the sport of greyhound racing. Now, I think it's very unlikely that we will ever get to a situation where horse sport has a psychological identification with society. But there's no reason why we can't try. But where we should be, at the very least, is where we have the approval of society. And I would suggest to all of us today that in far too many cases, it's just being tolerated. And in some cases, when we look at some disciplines and some issues within racing, it may not even be that. And at the foundation of the social license is the horse-human partnership. And it is that which is the foundation of responsible horse sport. What does that require? It obviously requires knowledge. The biggest issue and the biggest abuse of animals, of equines, across the world, in both developed nations and lower middle income countries, is ignorance. People who own equines who do not understand the basics of how to manage and care for their equines. But it's not just about knowledge. It is about experience and the community in which we live, and it is about having a compassion for the animals in our care. This, obviously, when we think about horse sport animals and about horse racing, animals are very unlikely to do their best unless we care for them in the best way possible. But it will also, if we do care for them in the best way possible, this is going to maximize their chances to have a second career after their sporting lifetime is over. And the horse-human partnership, as we'll talk about at the end, this, I think, is the basis of how we need to be talking to the public about horse sport. So, what I want to do now is just look at a few areas where we can put this into practice, especially our growing understanding of equine welfare. Because what we do know, horses are very good at injuring themselves. A piece of research at Liverpool University not many years ago shows that a horse is most likely to be injured at grass. So they are very good at injuring themselves. But we also have to accept that the risks a horse faces in the paddock is going to be a fraction of the risks going round a 5-star cross-country course, or indeed the risks in an intensive training program for dressage, for endurance, for racing. So we can never get to a risk-free basis for our sport. Life does not work like that. But we do have to do all we can to minimize that risk. But I've already said, equines suffer around the world mainly because of their interaction with humans, mainly because people are caring for them who don't have the basic understanding of how to care for them or can't be bothered. And I think it's really important when you look at how we handle and how we manage our horses on a daily basis, that has a huge, huge influence on the behavior of those animals. There is no such thing, in my view, as a naughty horse. Naughty horses come about either because of their experience with humans in their lifetime or because they have unresolved pain. And so we need, when we look at how we manage and care for our equines, to constantly come back to the 5 domains and to the 5 freedoms. There are Grand Prix dressage riders across the world, including Carl Hester, who puts their Grand Prix dressage horses out to grass with other horses. It is possible, although speaking to some people, you would think it isn't possible, but it really is possible. Again, one size doesn't fit all, and what works for one doesn't necessarily work for the other. But we have to at least to be open-minded to doing just that. Now, I get very excited talking about traceability because traceability is fundamental to maintaining our social license. Just when a disease incursion hits, if we don't know where our horses are, we won't be able to protect those animals in the best way possible through movement restrictions and vaccination where relevant. And so an effective equine identification system is so important. We have just in the UK established a central equine database. And I would implore Australia to do exactly that. And I know it's something that's being discussed at government at the moment, and we will do all we can to support that happening, because it is the fundamental way of protecting our animals, because unless you can identify an animal and identify the owner of that animal, there is no way of bringing that owner to book if those animals aren't being cared for in the proper way. But it's not just about that, because having a database, having an understanding will drive data, and through data we can understand where the risks are to our animals. And we see that in a very simple way. It's not around a central equine database, but I talked earlier about the FEI's injuries surveillance program. How frequently, how often, where, and why horses injure themselves is a way of understanding where the risks are and what we can then do to minimize those risks. And, especially in a racing context, we can understand what the best career options for animals are when they come off the racetrack. Of course, when we talk about equine welfare, it all begins at the beginning, and that's how we breed animals. And certainly, again, within the world of racing, but also across the horse sport more generally, we certainly get into trouble when we breed too many horses, when there aren't enough homes for the animals that we're breeding. So we need to consider the long-term future of every single foal that is bred. Something that is going to be a huge challenge, it is currently a challenge, and it's going to be a far more of a challenge over the coming years, is equine genomics. Cloning is a growing issue and a growing challenge for regulators to know how to manage that. And of course, we need to be very careful that we don't breed for weird and outrageous traits like this one here. We've seen the consequences of what happens in the canine world where we do that. We are at danger of going exactly the same route with our equines. And I know over the course of the next couple of days, there's going to be a lot of talk about training. And of course, how we train our horses and the techniques we use for training our horses is developing all the time. But one thing we always say is shortcuts very, very rarely work. And therefore, we need to take the time to train our animals, to train our horses, to do what we want them to do and to the required standard. And of course, we need to adapt that according to the context and environment in which we are holding those horses. An area that has been transformational over the last few years is our understanding of equine learning theory. And understanding that previously, they've still got a huge role to play, but previously a lot of equine training was based around negative reinforcement. You put the leg aid on until the horse does the desired thing, and then you take the leg aid off. But actually, we want to increasingly move towards negative reinforcement still has a role to play for sure, but the whole emphasis needs to be far more about positive reinforcement. And how we understand that for our horses is really important. I've already talked about the FEI Code of Conduct and how actually at its heart it is an ideal document because it couldn't be more clear. The welfare of the horses we compete must never be subordinated to competitive or commercial influences. And when people don't abide by that code, the consequences are significant. I don't particularly want to pick on Ollie Townend, but twice in Badminton 2 years ago, he got called out for overuse of the whip on both of his cross-country horses who were getting tired. It looked awful. What was as awful was the interview he gave afterwards, where he said, "Sometimes I ride clean, sometimes I ride dirty." And, you can understand in the heat of the moment, that is totally understandable. But if we learn nothing else from that, is that when the adrenaline is running around our veins, never speak to the press. Of course, a lot has been talked about tack and equipment, and tight nosebands, side reins, spurs, we'll talk about whips in a second, have all come under very, very close scrutiny. And for sure, dubious tack and equipment I believe, has no place. The overuse of side reins, some would say the use of side reins at all. But we also need to, because if we're having to take steps to control our horses, then we need to understand why they are behaving in that way. And for sure, we need to be absolutely sure that it's not because of unresolved pain. Research at the Animal Health Trust in the UK showed that nearly half of sport horses are lame. Maybe not very lame, but they are lame. And it's statistics like that which do a huge damage to the sector. Now, we do talk a lot about nosebands, and indeed, over-tight nosebands is a significant issue. But again, from the Animal Health Trust, Dr. Rachel Murray showed us that actually, when we look at the horse's head, it is the pole pressure, and it's the pressure on the side of the horse's face where the key nerves travel down that are of equal concern. So it's not about nosebands, it is about bridle fit as much as it is about saddle fit. So we've got to make sure that we are looking at the right issues that are really having a challenging impact on the welfare and the health of our horses. And of course, then we can talk about bitless bridles and barefoot trimming and all the rest of it. One size does not fit all. And the issues I've always had with many people who believe in bitless bridles is that many of them believe it's the only way to ride our horses. Frankly, the idea of going around a cross-country course in a bitless bridle, I'd prefer to go 200 kilometers an hour on one leg down a ski slope. So, the whip. It is ironic, and World Horse Welfare, it's a global organisation. And you go to some parts of the world where the key issue is the jockeys don't hit their horses enough. But in a vast majority of countries, that is completely opposite to the truth. People have huge concern around the use of the whip. We have gone on record now to say that I personally think the use of the whip in racing for encouragement, not for safety, has run its course. I do not believe in the eyes of the public that it's no longer it is possible to justify the use of using the whip to make our horses go faster. But it doesn't mean to say that over the years, in the UK, for example, a huge amount hasn't been done to improve the safety of the whip. And it doesn't mean to say that if I would look any of you in the eye and say, when we think about our racehorses, what are the key welfare issues? The whip wouldn't be in the top 10 as far as I'm concerned. Nevertheless, as far as the public are concerned, it's generally in the top 2, and we can't simply ignore that. So we then think, and Terry gave us a wonderful example yesterday about ex-thoroughbreds. Oh, no, they're still thoroughbreds, they're ex-racehorses, and what kind of careers that they can have. And horses, over their lifetime, what's extraordinary about a horse and the different ways we utilize them, from sport and leisure animals to working animals to animals used for therapy, is in a horse's lifetime, they can fulfill multiple roles. So when we think about careers, we do need to think about all of the potential careers a horse can take on. But we do need to make sure that the owners that take on our horses from the racetrack, from the sport or the discipline of endurance or whatever it be, that they have the competence to be able to do so. Because, not least, A, it is ethically the right thing to do, but B, because even a horse has never got onto the racetrack, never raced in its life, it was bred for racing, the public will view it as a racehorse. And it doesn't matter if a horse never got to go down the centre line, it will always be viewed as a sport horse if it was bred for sport. So we need to understand how the public view that. I mentioned at the beginning that World Horse Welfare, we rehome hundreds of animals every year. And we do that predominantly either as ridden animals or as companion animals. And we know that lots of horses coming out of elite horse sport and coming out of racing have got a rich career ahead of them, either as leisure animals, as lower grade sport horses, but we need to be sure that they are fit for purpose. It is very easy to actually think that we can just retire all the animals that come out of racing and then come out of horse sport. I would be very wary of ever viewing retirement as the easy option. I know there's a debate going on in racing in Australia and New South Wales around whether retirement farms are the way forward. I would seriously question where they are, because quality of life of our animals must always trump the quantity of life. And that's why end of life is such an important issue. It is the fundamental responsibility of all equine owners to give their equine a good life and a good death. And that is a very challenging, it doesn't make it easy, and it is very challenging, but it doesn't mean we can balk that responsibility as a result. And of course, it is very challenging for an equine welfare organisation to be talking about end of life, but I think it is so important. We run an initiative in the UK called Just In Case, because the worst time to be thinking about options for how you euthanize your animal is when that animal is in a poor condition, in poor health. The best time is to think about it when they're in good health. So you know what your options are. Are you going to have it shot or injected? Who's going to do it? How are you going to dispose of the body afterwards? All of these decisions need to be made, and they're very difficult to do when we are inevitably, and of course we will be, very emotional around the end of life of the animals in our care. Across the world, there are significant challenges, because in many countries, there isn't the trained personnel. In many countries, there aren't firearms, and there aren't the drugs to be able to euthanize our horses humanely. And that is a huge challenge. Equally a challenge is the cultural and religious approach to euthanasia. But having worked in countries that cover all significant or major religions, I do not believe, I know there isn't a religion that would actively support the abuse of animals in terms of keeping them alive beyond where they should be. Not a single one. Now, I think it's very easy to conclude out of the horrific coverage of the ABC programme that horse slaughter is wrong. That is not the view of World Horse Welfare. As I said to you at the beginning, our founder actually didn't have the issue of people eating horse meat. She had the issue of the conditions in which those animals were transported. And when we talk about slaughter, we need to think about the transport, how they are cared for on arrival, and then how they are killed at the end. And it's important that there's equal welfare consideration through all of those stages. For some people, we would never dream of sending our animals to the slaughterhouse. But we do not believe that those who decide to do that should be viewed any less as a result, so long as our animals are slaughtered humanely, and by that we mean at least to OIE standards. And again, the biggest issues, and we've been into many slaughterhouses across the world, the biggest issues of how the welfare of those animals is how they are handled by the staff. As you'll see, it is a very common theme. So when we think what are the acceptable choices, we need to also consider what are the unacceptable choices. For sure, we should never be prioritizing quantity of life over quality. It is so easy to kick the can down the road. There was something slightly wrong with my horse, so I'll sell it on. We have seen time and time again when horses like that, which have issues, are sold on, they will get sold on, and they will go in a spiral of decline and end up in a perilous state. And of course, as I've already said, we need to ensure that the animals that we're rehoming from the racetrack, from a horse sport, are going to homes with the adequate competence. And of course, that's on one level. We cannot simply keep all of our horses alive forever. But on the other level, we can't simply just routinely send them to slaughter or send them to be dispatched at the end of their life routinely. Each horse needs to be considered on its own merits, and we need to make sure that we are making the right decisions, the right ethical decisions around the future of our horses. So throughout this, we need, as I've said throughout, we need to challenge the status quo. I don't know how many, I know in the racing world, most racehorses are on Gastrogard or equivalent because to prevent them getting gastric ulcers. And it was something that we were always taught at school, that you treat the cause, not the symptom. The cause of racehorses getting gastric ulcerations is because they're stressed. And the reason that they're stressed, often, not always, is because they have no access to pasture. So we need to challenge the way. We can't simply put a plaster over the consequences of the way we're managing our horses. Especially in racing, we need to challenge some of the routine interventions, like wind operations. But including sport horses, we need to really be questioning how often are we medicating joints. And above all, at the bottom there, we need to be looking at the facts. What are the wastage rates in our industry? And I'm guilty of it. We shouldn't be using terms like wastage rates, but we should be looking at what the future are for our horses that come out of sport. I'm almost done. I think what's really important now, having sort of heard of all of that, and I'm sure some of it you'll agree with, some of it you might have a few issues with, but we have got to be far better about communicating on welfare. Because if you look at the media across the world, when you generally hear about equine welfare, it's because of doping, it's because of fatalities, it's because of issues at abattoirs. It's all negative. People's association with equine welfare is mostly negative because those are the stories that they hear about. And that's why it's so important that we are far better at articulating the ethical basis for using horses in sport. It is a relationship. That means it's two-way. And therefore, there's a balance to that. I think many people who want to ban the use of horses want all horses to be at nature, to be at pasture at nature. Now, we know that nature's not very kind, and therefore, we're absolute fools if we think that that is the ideal, that is the sort of the panacea of where we want to get to. So we've got to understand that the way we care for our horses is a balance. But I think we also need to look at it through a different lens. We need to stop thinking as horsemen, and we need to think of people who don't have an understanding of horses? How are they understanding how we care for our horses? As I've said, more often than not, they're just getting negative news stories. So we've got to be far more than about avoiding the negative. Racing, quite rightly, has a real focus on fatality rates. And in British racing, that has gone down from 0.3% to 0.2% of all starters. But if you're a cynic, and I apologise for being so direct, but saying you killed less horses this year than you did last year is a rather bizarre justification for the sport. But it certainly doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing all we can to reduce fatality rates. And as I said at the beginning, we need to think about more than just providing the basics. At our conference that we had in London last year, so many people talked about racehorses being treated like royalty. Now, if we think of equine welfare as a horse with a nice rug on its back in a lovely stables with a full hay net, then maybe they are being treated like royalty. But when we start considering their mental well-being, maybe they're not. An initiative that British racing has been running for the last few years is the horse comes first. And there's a lot of good stuff that's been done through that. But look at it through the different lens. The horse comes first. Well, that's the minimum, isn't it? We shouldn't be just talking about the horse comes first. It's what we're doing in addition to that. And so all of that brings us to a justification for why we believe in the responsible use of horses in sport. Because, as I've already said, there are going to be bad days. And if we have a greater understanding, if our tolerance, if our social license is such that people have a greater understanding that nothing in the equine world is risk-free, then we'll be able to weather the storms when they inevitably come. But there will be good news too. And I think this is something that, who was it? Was Anne yesterday talked about, those who actually consistently show the best horsemanship and the most humane training are almost always going to be the ones that come out with the best results in the end. I think within communicating that equine welfare story is we need to really be sure that we know who our ambassadors are, because people really do look up. They really do look up. In Australia, I guess it's the likes of Andrew Hoy and Boyd Excel and many others. And we need to make sure that they are leading by example, because this is where it's really important. Horse sport and elite horse sport is very much in the public eye. But if we really want to impact on the most equines, we need to think the ones that are the local shows across the world. And what people do at local shows, in part, will reflect the care and training and approach to equine welfare that our leading riders take to. So we need to understand that it is a collective responsibility. Each and every one of us has a role in cultivating the social license for the equestrian sport. So where do we need to go? We certainly need to invest in further research, because I think you hear it so often, horses love doing what they do. I don't doubt that for a minute, but the cynic would say the scientific basis for proving that horses love doing what they do is somewhat shallow. And I think there's far more we need to do to understand how we can substantiate that claim. And as I said, we need to collectively cultivate this social license. So, the whole focus of this presentation has been the fact that we need to accept that for the future of horse sport to survive and thrive, that we have to have a social license to operate. And that means putting the welfare of our horses first and being seen to do so, and understanding that we all have a collective responsibility to doing that. We need to understand that the world we live in is changing and our understanding of equine welfare is changing. Therefore, at all stages of a horse's life, how we care, manage, train, breed, and end their lives, we need to reflect on that and challenge, are we still doing the best that we can do? And we need to understand, because a sport horse, because a race horse is that for life, it is a lifetime responsibility. And we always need to make sure at the centre of our thinking that their quality of life will always trump their quality of life. And in these advancements, especially around genomics, just because we can do something doesn't mean we should do something. And for sure, in all that we do with our horses, the easy decision is rarely the right one. Thank you very much indeed.